Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I'm your host, Franco. Today, we are having a very special event. I have Dr. Ben Burgis and Dennis Potvin debating about whose legacy from 2020 should progressives follow going forward into the future. Is it Senator Bernie Sanders or is it Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard? Dr. Ben Burgis is representing Bernie Sanders. How are you doing today, Ben?
It's Burgis, but I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. And Dennis is representing Tulsi Gabbard. How are you doing today, Dennis?
Yeah, you would have never guessed I'm representing Tulsi Gabbard.
Never would have guessed.
Beautiful day here in Nashville. No riots yet. 4 o'clock, we've got our rally downtown, so we'll see how it goes.
So I welcome and thank you both for being here. I think these conversations and debates are very important to have so that we can all understand each other better. Dennis, I hope you can learn a lot from Dr. Burgis today, and Dr. Burgis, I hope you can learn a lot from Dennis. Let us not forget that in the end, we all want a government that is free of corruption and more representative of what the people want, not what the few wealthy corporate elites want. So I will explain how everything will work for this debate. First, I will start by asking you two to give a 1-minute introduction, and feel free to give any shout outs that you like about where people can find you and Patreons and things of that nature. And then after the introductions, I will explain what we will do next. So who wants to start first?
Well, I only have a master's. He's a doctor, so he should go.
Okay. Name is Ben Burgis. I'm a philosophy instructor at Georgia State University, Perimeter College in Atlanta, or at least I am right now. We'll see what happens with the state budget cuts that are coming up because of the crisis. I also write a weekly column for Jacobin, co-host of a podcast called The Dead Pundit Society, to do a regular segment on the Michael Brooks Show. And if all that's not enough and you're enough of a glutton for punishment that you want to see even more from me, I do indeed have a Patreon where you can read a couple of essays a week and do some kind of regular group voice chats, which have been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot from the people who are members of that community. Dennis?
Well, I'm kind of a lifelong political nomad. I've voted for Republicans and Democrats since 1992 when I voted for H.W. Bush. I've worked in manufacturing for 26 years. I'm a graduate of the University of Michigan, but I do have my master's from Austin Peay here in Clarksville, Tennessee. They did make the NCAA tournament a couple of years ago, so we are the Austin Peay Governors. I was an Eagle Scout back in the day. I was nominated to the U.S. Naval Academy in 1990, but I had a back injury that not only kept me out of Annapolis, but also forced me out of service altogether. So my whole family are servicemen and women, and I would have been the first officer, but that didn't happen. I've written a children's book called Asia and Zola. You can find on Amazon. I was the Democratic primary winner in 2018 here for House of Representatives before getting completely smoked in the general election by the incumbent speaker. And I was a staunch supporter of the Tulsi 2020 campaign. If she had secured delegates here in Tennessee, I'd have been one of them. So you can find me on Twitter at Dennis Potman Dem, and I am a local contributor to Frank Analysis and Big Talk Little Talk.
Nice. By the way, I should say we do have one thing in common, at least, which is if you went to U of M, that we both used to live in Michigan. I grew up there. And I stayed. I went to. I never went to U of M, but I went to small college in Grand Rapids for my undergrad, and Western Michigan in Kalamazoo for my master's.
Oh, was that Grand Valley State you went to?
No, smaller than that. Small Catholic college, Aquinas.
Okay. Yeah, I lived in Michigan for 42 years.
Oh wow. Okay. You got me beat. I lived there for the first 26 years of my life, but not since then.
Yeah, I grew up in Flint.
Okay.
Yeah, before the water went bad. So,
All right.
Yeah, back when it was just deindustrialized and brutalized and like a dystopian ravaged place, but at least you had drinking water.
I remember Michael Moore making Roger and Me while I was in college.
Still think it's the best movie.
Oh, glad to see that you guys are finding out you guys have a lot in common. So next, I will allow you both to give a 5-minute opening statement about whose legacy is best for progressives to follow. Please respect each other's time to speak. I know both of you are already very respectful based on observations that I've made from video footage that I've seen of you guys. Then you guys can go back and forth for 30 minutes maximum, after which I will ask more specific questions. Each of you have a maximum of 5 minutes of speaking time before letting the other person speak. And I will only interject if someone speaks over someone else. So with that being said, who will go first for the opening statement? And remember, you have 30 minutes to go back and forth. So I'll start the timer right now.
Dennis, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, let's go back to January 11th of 2019. Tulsi Gabbard announced on television that she was going to run for president of the United States with her core message, her one thing, being that she wanted to end our policy of regime change wars overseas and redirect the money, the resources that we were wasting on those wars into the American society. She wanted to do so with single-payer health care, with pre-secondary education, with increases in minimum wage, and vocational training, just basically an investment in the American people rather than the waste overseas. She launched her campaign formally on February 2nd, 2019 in Hawaii. And for many of us, Tulsi represented the most credentialed and the best presidential candidate of our lifetimes. And the reason I say that is because I saw that she built her political career from the ground up. She served in city council. She served in state legislature. She had been a member of the DNC. She was the vice chair. And in addition to that, she had served 4 terms in Congress. Now, on top of that, she served 16 years in the Army National Guard with 2 deployments in the Middle East. So she was young. She was 30 years old. She was composed. She was very telegenic. And I just loved the credentials that she brought for candidacy. But most importantly, she avoided the dog whistle politics that have become very common since the late 90s. Since, Bill Clinton became Slick Willie and basically became front page fodder for the National Enquirer. Over the last 20 years, that's been the norm, and Tulsi seemed to avoid that. She had a history of progressive legislation that appealed to voters like me who are looking for real change, who are sick of the same old Washington corruption. Yet she proposed that legislation in a way that was palatable to voters from both sides of the aisle, which is why her appeal expanded beyond Democrats. It included independents and Republicans and libertarians. She earned the respect of very high-profile conservative media, which you would think would be like gold for a Democrat to be able to accomplish, but it turned out to not help her. They invited her on the air frequently, and I think they did so because she avoided she didn't stoop to social justice commentary or gender politics. She never even mentioned that we should have a woman in the White House or anything like that. She just never talked about it. But yes, she also had some respect on the independent media side because, of course, they knew she had dropped out of her seat as the vice chair of the DNC in 2016 to endorse Sanders. So, again, for me personally, she was on the right side of issues that were most important to me. She supported our privacy rights. She supported a free press, including whistleblowers like Assange and Snowden, and she was very vocal about that. She was against the Clinton corruption machine. She was for single-payer health. She was for raising minimum wage. She was for free secondary education. She was for ending the wars. She was against the Saudi regime. That, we couldn't be America couldn't be Saudi Arabia's bitch. She was for strong borders and immigration laws. And she was pro-choice, although she was against third trimester abortion. So she and I ideologically aligned because I had just ran a campaign and I supported a lot of the things that she was running on. So if you were a progressive commentator or just a voter, you had to be ecstatic that we now had a candidate in the race who could take on anyone and seemed to bring a lot of positives to it. And if Bernie Sanders had simply repaid his debt to her and gotten behind her candidacy and rallied his movement and his fundraising apparatus behind her, we'd be talking about a whole different race right now, especially if she had emerged and maybe joined up with Yang. Can you imagine them as the ticket now against Trump? But 17 days after she announced, on February 19th, Bernie Sanders got in the race. And of course, this is also after Warren had gone in. And I don't know really what the reason was. Hillary knew better than to get in the race because she knew she hadn't fixed anything from her own loss, and I didn't feel that Bernie had fixed any of his liabilities from the 2016 loss either. But he got in the race, and I just didn't know his motivation for doing so. But what happened was he presented this big roadblock in the
30
middle
seconds.
of the highway that no one could get around. What's that?
30 seconds.
Okay. And so we found that candidates like Yang and even Buttigieg and Harris and Warren, they all had to revise their platforms in order to find any sunlight. And I just felt that Bernie didn't have a reason to get in the race, and he effectively smothered every other candidate. He smothered third-party candidates, and especially smothered Tulsi Gabbard from getting any sunlight and getting any air in independent media. So
that's time.
Okay.
All right. So thank you guys for the debate invitation. I think when we think about why I think the legacy of Bernie Sanders has been so tremendously positive. In fact, I think the best thing about Tulsi Gabbard's legacy is her endorsement of him in 2016. I mean, you have to look at the way that the landscape of American politics was transformed by that campaign. So, in fact, I think one of the best pieces of evidence of it is the way that the 2020 campaign played out. So, in 2016, Bernie Sanders ran what was supposed to be a marginal protest campaign. If you look at the stuff that people were writing when he first announced in 2015, then they thought that the upper ceiling of his support would be like maybe 10, 15%. Basically, he was perceived as a Dennis Kucinich style sideshow, or at the risk of being ruining what's been a very friendly conversation so far, a Tulsi 2020 style sideshow, right? Something that where he wasn't going to win any states, but maybe he would raise some issues. But instead, this person who most of the country had never heard of before, outside of Vermont, who looked like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, who called himself a socialist, which is totally out of bounds in the rules of American politics as they'd existed for as long as anybody could remember, won 22 states in a race against the former Secretary of State, former First Lady, who was supported by 100% of the Democratic establishment, and who all of the, other than Martin O'Malley, I guess, all of the other centrists had gotten out of the way to pave the way for her run. Obviously, 2020 was going to be a more challenging landscape because there were many more candidates and much more ideological confusion than what was provided by the clear contrast between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. But even in that very crowded field, he did a remarkable, unprecedented thing in the history of seriously contested primaries and won all three of the first three contests. You've never gotten that before from somebody who didn't just sweep everything like John Kerry in 2004. And at first, all the other candidates were pretending to agree with his platform because he'd done such a good job of mainstreaming basically all the stuff that we just heard Dennis mention: single-payer health care, free tuition-free public higher education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a lot of the centrist Democrats initially pretending to support those things, realizing that sort of looking like a watered-down Bernie clone wasn't going to get them anywhere, in many cases flopping around between the lanes trying to decide whether to be Bernie light or Buttigieg light before crashing and burning, which is what happened, for example, to Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren. And I think it would, of course, everybody knew from that Bernie Sanders was going to run again 2020. There was never a moment's doubt about that. Essentially, he never stopped running between 2016 and 2020. He was constantly doing rallies around the country. He was constantly in the limelight. Whatever the formal announcement was, that was very much a formality. And what I've never understood, and what can perhaps be clarified more in this debate, is even putting aside particular criticisms of the limits of Tulsi Gabbard's politics that I think are important, and that I'm sure that we'll get into later, is what changed, right? So there's no particular reason to think that if that Bernie Sanders would have not run in favor of a candidate who everybody knew was going to have a marginal impact, if any, on the race. Essentially, she had no impact on the race. But what changed for Tulsi Gabbard between 2016 and 2020? If Bernie Sanders was a good vessel for politics then, what is it that she thought changed? And perhaps we could hear more about that as the debate progresses.
All right. Dennis, your response?
Well, I do agree with Ben that Bernie never stopped running. He ran 5 continuous years. He missed 60% of his votes in the Senate. He has the worst attendance of any senator for the last 5 years because he has been campaigning continuously for president. He's raised over $400 million to do it. He's had more media exposure than any candidate other than Trump for the last 5 years. And so really, I guess we have to ask what changed, I think, and this is just from personal experience, is that a lot of his voters grew up and realized what the folks in Vermont realized, which is that Bernie promises things that he can't possibly deliver. See, there's a big difference between Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, and that is Bernie Sanders, 90% of his stump speech has absolutely nothing to do with the office of the presidency. None of the things that he talks about as far as raising minimum wage or free college or taking down $1 trillion health insurance industry has anything to do with the power of the presidency. That's the power of Congress. But see, he does that and he presents all these pie-in-the-sky ideas to build his popularity. His first rally may have only had a few hundred people, but when you tell them you're going to give them all $15 an hour to work at McDonald's, you get a few more people. And then you tell them, you're going to give them not just 2 years of free college, but 4 years of free college. Now you get a couple hundred more people. And pretty soon you get thousands of people because you're promising things you can't deliver. And the people in Vermont know this about Bernie Sanders, which is why he got 80% of the vote 4 years ago and 50% of the vote this time. They know he's not going to deliver on it because he doesn't have the power to write the legislation. He doesn't have the power in Congress. The allies in Congress get anything passed. He doesn't write legislation. He does promise things he can't deliver. And that's why the people in Vermont don't have single-payer health care. They don't have free college. They don't have anywhere close to a $15 an hour minimum wage. They're still fully relying on fossil fuels because he has no influence even in one of the smallest states by population in the country. There's less people in Vermont than there are here in Nashville. And he has not been able to get any of his issues passed in his own home state with a 70% Democratic legislature and universal name recognition. He can't get anything. And I know that he's a U.S. politician, but the fact is that his voters grew up. They say that why don't more and more kids every year play with toys? Because as new kids play with toys, kids grow out of playing with toys. So a new generation comes in and believes in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus, but at the same time, another generation grows up and says, I don't believe in those things anymore. And that's what happened with Bernie's voters. They all bought into this story in 2016, but by 2020, they grew up. And they went with another candidate, whether it was Yang or Tulsi, people who were talking about things that could realistically be passed, like ending the wars, like UBI, which is what we're seeing with Yang.
All right. Dr. Burgis, your response?
How many minutes for the response?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we heard a couple of claims just now that are worth interrogating. So one of them was that Bernie Sanders promises that things that he can't deliver that have nothing to do with the office of the presidency, and that perhaps the reason that he didn't win in 2020, or if it was a response to my question about Tulsi's decision not to endorse in 2020, that maybe the reason Tulsi decided he wasn't going to win, or that like her running herself was a better shot, than endorsing her, that endorsing Bernie Sanders again in 2020 is because she realized that voters grew up and really, stopped believing in the tooth fairy, which I guess in this case would be that a president can lead a successful movement for Medicare for all, tuition-free public higher education, ending the wars, and the rest of the stuff that Bernie Sanders has consistently talked about over the years. So, in particular, we heard the claim that voters in Vermont have come to realize that Bernie can't deliver, and he's not serious, and they've grown disillusioned with him, and that this has something to do with why Vermont doesn't have single payer. So let's do that in reverse order. Why doesn't Vermont have single payer? This is a widespread myth propagated by centrists that, see, Vermont, what they'll often say is it tried to do single payer, but it didn't succeed. And of course, this is flatly false in almost every possible way that it could be false. So what happened was that a Vermont's then Democratic governor had proposed this plan, Blue Mountain Care, which was not single payer. It was a public option. Sorry, I think that's Green Mountain Care. Anyway, whatever the color of the mountain was, that's what they were going to call it, which was not single payer. It was a public option, which by the way, sometimes during the campaign, I noticed the final version of her website was much clearer, but at some points in the campaign, Tulsi's website made it sound a lot more like what she was talking about, was something more like the Pete Buttigieg Medicare for All Who Want It, than a clear, unambiguous Medicare for All platform that Bernie has been talking about continuously since long before either of us were born. So first problem is it wasn't single payer, it was public option. In fact, you probably couldn't do single payer on a state level because trying to ban health insurance companies from doing business in the state, which is what you need for it to be single payer, would almost certainly be seen as illegal given the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution. And then it didn't fail, as people often say. Instead, that governor got cold feet. I have no idea what a U.S. senator is supposed to do about that. But are the people of Vermont disillusioned with Bernie Sanders? If so, they have a funny way of showing it, because he has, last polling I saw, which was certainly long after the 2016 election, the highest in-state approval of any sitting U.S. senator. He wins Democratic primaries, even though he's not even planning on using their ballot line for office. He runs as an independent. He wins Democratic primaries in Vermont by numbers reminiscent of Saddam Hussein's wins in Iraqi elections, and even the general elections. Right, he comfortably wins with 2/3 of the vote. He is extraordinarily popular in Vermont. So if we're going to take the views of those who know him best as a good indicator, then I would say that those who know him best seem to like what they're seeing. That's the track record of Bernie in Vermont. He started out as a mayor in Burlington. He ran for statewide office a few times before he finally won as an independent, running against a Democratic nominee as well as a Republican one, because over the course of these elections, the more they saw of him, the more they liked him. Finally, and I know I've only got 40 seconds left, but finally, on the subject of what a president can do and what a president can do, Bernie, this has always been one of the best
30
parts.
seconds.
Yeah, of what Bernie Sanders has to offer, the fact that he's got a clear-eyed view of the fact that what you need is a mobilized grassroots movement from below to shake up the system and achieve these things, and that the use of the presidential bully pulpit to mobilize and lead such a movement. Presidential candidates have always talked about, policy issues like these that would need the approval of Congress, but he has by far the best strategy to actually achieve that.
Right. Dennis, your response?
Well, if he has the power of the bully pulpit, I wonder why people of Vermont gave Joe Biden delegates. I wonder why Republicans keep getting elected governor in his home state. I wonder why his vote tally dropped 30%. And I think it's just time that you and I agree. The reason he overperformed in 2016 was because he was running against one of the least popular politicians that has ever run for any office in the United States. This is a woman who lost to a black man with a Muslim name right after the start of the Iraq War. This is a woman who lost to a game show host and a political novice that same year. But yet Bernie Sanders couldn't beat her. So having fixed none of the liabilities from 2016, whether that was a complete lack of a Southern strategy, black outreach, the fact that the mainstream media was completely biased against him, the fact that he was going to have establishment people encroach his campaign because he had become absorbed into the establishment by becoming a leader of the Democratic Party. I don't understand why you would think that Bernie Sanders had a viable shot in 2020, especially now that he was 78 years old, now that he did have declining health, the fact that he had no imprint outside of the coast whatsoever, which we've just seen in the results of this primary. I guess I don't understand why we would think he would perform well. Maybe that's why Tulsi got in the race. Tulsi was very close to his campaign in 2016, so I'm sure she saw a lot of things. A lot of liabilities with that campaign that caused him to lose to Hillary Clinton. But the other thing that I want to talk about is Tulsi's single payer plus was not a public option. That was a private option. Everybody has to pay in for those taxes. There is no opt out of it. It's very much like public and private school. Everybody pays into the single payer healthcare system that Tulsi proposed. There's no way to opt out of it. So everybody pays in, just like we pay taxes for public schools. However, if you want to keep your doctor, if you want something more, you can pay more. You can pay like you pay tuition for private school. You can pay for that additional coverage, which would give you, whether it was specialized care or being able to keep your doctor. That's what her program was offering. But there was no opt out of it. It was a single payer health. So it was not like the Pete Buttigieg Medicare for all who want it. But anyway, I guess looking at the liabilities of the Sanders campaign from 2016 to 2020, I guess I just don't understand why you would have thought he needed to get in the race when he had allies already in the race. Elizabeth Warren was good buddies with him. Tulsi Gabbard risked everything for him, and 95% of their platforms matched. So I can tell you on a local level, there was a state Senate seat open here after the election that I lost. A woman wanted to run for that seat. She called me and said, hey, if you're going to run for that Senate seat, I'll sit out and support you. If you're not going to run, I'm going to run. And I said, you know what? You can have it. Let me know when you start to run, and I'll give you the first $100 to your campaign. And that's the way it works. That's why Hillary didn't run. She had Joe Biden in the race. She had Julian Castro in the race. She had Kirsten Gillibrand in the race. She had Al already representing her and representing corporate Democrats in the race. That's why Hillary Clinton was smart enough not to run this time. She already had ponies in the race. But Bernie Sanders had Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard in there and said, nah, hell with you. I'm going to run anyway. And I don't see why you would think it was a good idea. And in retrospect, it was a horrible idea. He got smoked.
All right, Dr. Burgis, your response?
Yeah. So first of all, the distinction between single payer and what Dennis just described is extremely important, and it's worth underlining and circling a couple times. What he's describing is a multi-payer system. One, sure, everybody might pay into. Everybody pays into Medicaid too. But there's a couple of really important differences between that and a Canadian-style single-payer system where you might have supplemental insurance for whatever is not covered. For what it's illegal to sell duplicate health insurance. But if you have things that aren't covered by the public plan, you can have a specific plan for that, and something that is along the lines of public schools, where you have public schools, but you also have private schools. One of the differences between those things is that with single payer, everybody gets the same quality of coverage. With a system that works like schools work right now, much like schools themselves, you have two tiers, right? You've got healthcare for those who can afford better healthcare, healthcare for the prosperous, and healthcare for the poor. Unless you add something, and perhaps it did, to specifically outlaw this, you're going to get what you get a lot with Medicaid, which is that you'll have doctors and hospitals who just won't take it. Right? Everybody has to take emergency room patients, but lots of doctors don't take Medicaid because they can get a higher rate of reimbursement from private plans than they can from that. So again, you have discrimination in two tiers for the poor and everybody else. You also have you don't have a lot of the cost-cutting benefits of true single-payer plans and this kind of multi-payer plan. We're sure everybody's covered by this, but you can have duplicate two-tier private insurance because a lot of the other costs of the system that people oftentimes, when they think they're making a sophisticated objection to single payer, they say, oh, but there are all these things besides insurance, drive up costs. Well, if you have only one entity doing the paying, they have tremendous bargaining power to reduce all of those costs. If you have multiple entities, as in what we just heard as the description of Tulsi's plan, then that's not then you're just not going to get that benefit. The fact that candidates like Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg and ultimately Elizabeth Warren spent so much time fudging the distinction between a simple Canadian-style single-payer Medicare for all plan and all these other plans is itself a backhanded tribute to the profound effect that Bernie Sanders has had in reshaping American politics in the last 5 years. You know that these phrases, Medicare for all, single payer, are very popular, especially among Democratic primary voters. So, you want a little bit of that juice for whatever you're proposing, but you don't actually want to clearly and unambiguously endorse that. So you use some of those same phrases. You say, oh, this is single payer, except there are multiple payers. Oh, this is Medicare for all, the Buttigieg version, for all who want it. As to the idea that Bernie Sanders already had people in the race who represented his views, first of all, again, everybody knew Bernie was running long before either Tulsi or Elizabeth Warren decided to run. That's obvious, right? So fetishizing what the dates of the announcement as if we didn't know that when Bernie never stopped running is a little bit silly. As to the difference between Sanders on the one hand and Warren, obviously, Sanders and everybody else knew that Tulsi was always going to be a footnote in the race. There was no scenario where she was ever going to be a major candidate, but Warren
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. We will talk about the differences between Sanders and these other candidates at a later point of the debate. Right now, I just want to make the point about Vermont. Why did Biden pick up delegates in Vermont? Biden got 20% in Vermont, even though that happened after this unprecedented consolidation behind Biden, when it became very clear that Biden was going to be the nominee, and Biden swept almost all the other states other than California on Super Tuesday. So the fact that Bernie Sanders still beat him by well over 2-1 in Vermont once again goes to the fact how damn popular he is in that state.
All right, so thank you guys very much. The following 4 questions will be more specific to who proposed the better policies in their 2020 campaigns and why progressives should move forward with those policies in the future. Here, there will be no back and forth. It will just be a 5-minute statement of why your candidate presented the best policy. So we will start first with environmental policy. So who will start first?
I can start first.
Sure.
Well, Tulsi's a lifelong environmentalist. She was an activist on the environment since she was a teenager. She traveled schools across Hawaii to educate students on the importance of our watersheds, and her Off Fossil Fuels Act was groundbreaking legislation that has been endorsed by over 400 organizations, including a certain candidate who was running in New York in 2018, named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's pushed for legislation funding to protect our oceans and reefs and water infrastructure and national parks. Obviously, that's one of her core policy platforms. Hawaii is, of course, home to 410,000 acres of living coral reefs, so it's very close to her heart. She received the Ocean Impossibilities Award for ocean conservation work. And obviously, when DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was going in, she was very aggressive to work against the problems of that and actually stood beside those protesters. So obviously, the question is, the Off Fossil Fuels Act, that was something initiated in 2017 by Tulsi herself. I guess the question is, when the Green New Deal took up steam, which was taken by Sanders and Cortez and them from the Green Party, whereas Tulsi's legislation was originated by Tulsi and was supported by over 400 groups. I guess the question was, why didn't Bernie Sanders get behind that legislation and propose it in the U.S. Senate after Tulsi had done so in the House? That's just one of those things that makes me kind of scratch my head about Sanders. As far as what his commitment to the environment really is. I think he pays a lot of lip service, but he didn't stand with the protesters at DAPL like she did. He just talks about the Green New Deal, which isn't even legislation. It's just an idea, like a lot of Sanders proposals like Medicare for All. It's an idea. It's not based on reality. It's not based on what Medicare really is. Medicare is a brand name, just like Kleenex. It's actually a living thing right now, and he has co-opted that. But then we've seen Sanders has done that. He's a political plagiarist. He lifted the Green New Deal. He lifted raising the minimum wage. He lifted Medicare for all. He basically gets in front of things we're seeing and do that with UBI right now. Yanni and Tulsi proposed $1,000 a month. Romney proposed $1,200 a month. So what's Sanders doing? $2,000 a month. Clinton had written about that about what happened in 2016, and it's absolutely true. So I guess my question is, if Sanders was so dedicated to the environment, why not take actual tangible legislation like the Off Fossil Fuels Act and push that in the U.S. Senate? Maybe Ben can explain.
All right, Ben.
Yeah. So first of all, I know this is an answer to the question, not a response, but because it's relevant to both, I should say that I'm looking at a 2016 ABC News story called Bernie Sanders Joins Dakota Access Pipeline Protesters. So that's just not factually accurate. But what Bernie Sanders has done is a couple things, right? One, of course, he was a supporter of the Green New Deal resolution, which was unlike any sort of thing that, again, is a footnote to a footnote that Tulsi Gabbard might symbolically propose, and there's nothing wrong with symbolically proposing things if the effect of symbolically proposing them, even knowing that it will never be voted on, is that it raises a lot of attention for what you're doing, and it's high profile enough to be a meaningful test of where various political figures stand on the issue. That's something that you can do if you have the kind of profile that Bernie Sanders does. Of course, he doesn't have presidential bully pulpit because he's not the president, but he is a very prominent figure, and he has used it to help do things like create extremely detailed, worked out Medicare for all legislation and get people to either co-sponsor it or not, create extremely detailed and well worked out Green New Deal legislation, which he did during his campaign. The original The original resolution was a resolution, not a fully worked out proposal, but it was an excellent first step, which is why it did get so many co-sponsors. Tulsi's officially stated reason for not co-sponsoring it certainly wasn't that it wasn't original enough, because if that were the reason, then nobody would ever sponsor. She could never sponsor anything that wasn't written by her. It was that it didn't explicitly rule out all nuclear energy. Which, even though, this is also criticism I have of Bernie Sanders, I think he also made the mistake in his more worked out Green New Deal proposal of completely ruling out all nuclear energy. I don't think that's a realistic short-term goal at the same time that we're trying to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as we have to for the scale of the crisis. But why is the Green New Deal so important? And this is really worth underlining and circling a couple times, because one, of course, it's actually climate action on the scale that we need, given the urgency of the problem, but also, just as importantly, it fuses together two things that need to be fused together if we're going to have an effective political strategy for climate change. We've already seen that that climate austerity, using climate action to justify doing things like raise gas taxes that are paid by ordinary people, isn't a winning strategy. Look at how that worked out for Macron in France. What we need to do, and what the Green New Deal does, and and both the original resolution and Bernie, the well worked out, detailed version of it that Bernie Sanders proposed during the 2020 campaign, is to fuse together radical climate action with radical, deeply popular economic proposals. Because if the right can fearmonger, climate action is going to take away your jobs and lead to all these dismal results, just saying, yeah, but it's so important, isn't going to work. Maybe it should, but it's not going to. Whereas if you can say that we're fusing this together with all of these measures that are going to have a measurable impact on the standard of living of ordinary people, that we're going to create all of these new jobs, in order to create this green infrastructure, good, unionized public sector jobs, that could be a political winner.
So the next question is on who had the best healthcare policy.
I just want to fact check the correction there that Ben gave me. Bernie Sanders joined the protesters in Washington, D.C. He did not go to Standing Rock. That protest was in Washington. So going on Twitter and Facebook and joining the protesters in Washington is not the same as actually going to the hotspot itself, like Tulsi Gabbard did. As far as healthcare, Tulsi's single payer is the best because it's realistic and it's not dishonest like Medicare for All is. But Bernie Sanders likes to say for 5 years he's been spreading falsehoods about Medicare being free. Now, first of all, he and Jane aren't on Medicare. They're still on their Cadillac Senate benefits. So he might not know any better. But Medicare actually has a monthly premium. It has pays. It has out-of-pocket expenses. And it has deductibles. In fact, the average monthly premium for Medicare for my parents, in fact, is $134 a month. Medicare is a brand. It is a current healthcare system. So to say we're going to have Medicare for all, it's going to be free at the point of use, no co-pays, no deductibles, no out-of-pocket, is dishonest because that's not what Medicare is now. So to say that I'm going to take the Medicare age from 62 to cover everybody, that's fine, but don't say it's free because it's not. But again, as I alluded to earlier, Bernie, to increase his crowds, to make his following more passionate, he likes to make it not just ice cream, but ice cream with chocolate and sprinkles and whipped cream and a cherry on top. But unfortunately, that's dishonest. Tulsi's program, Care Plus, is recognized that you will never get rid of private insurance. If Bernie Sanders couldn't get a single Our Revolution candidate elected in the 2018 midterms, if he couldn't flip a single red seat in Congress, in the governors, in the Senate, in the House, at the states, from red to blue, with one of his Our Revolution candidates that he backs with his time and his money, then he sure as hell is not going to get rid of $1 trillion private health insurance industry. He's not going to do it. He doesn't have enough allies. So if he doesn't have the power to do that, then why tell people you can? You can't. What Tulsi's recognizing is you will never get rid of private insurance. So she has created a policy, Single Payer Plus, that allows them still room to exist, but which provides a healthcare platform that still you can opt out of and that covers everyone.
All right. Dr. Burgis?
Yeah. All right. First of all, is Bernie Sanders being somehow dishonest by saying that his Medicare for All proposal would be unlike existing Medicare in that it would eliminate the premiums, copays, deductibles, etc. Well, you don't have premiums for the basic, you do for the supplemental versions of Medicare, but let's not get off on a tangent about that. No, clearly not. He's been crystal clear that Medicare for All means public health insurance, for all, that we would be expanding what Medicare does for seniors as well as extending it to everybody else. I'm actually deeply confused by the idea that it's somehow dishonest to say we're both going to expand. We're going to expand what the program covers to be more like Canadian Medicare at the same time as we eliminate the age limit. That seems pretty straightforward and pretty easy to sum up with the phrase Medicare for all. And of course, nobody would have been talking about Medicare for All or any of these misleading, mislabeled semi-Medicare for All, semi-single payer plans like Pete Buttigieg's Medicare for All Who Want It, or Tulsi Gabbard's single payer, multi-payer system, if not for the fact that Bernie Sanders did such a good job of popularizing the demand for Medicare for All in 2016, when Tulsi Gabbard was supporting a campaign whose central premise was that apparently dishonest, according to Dennis, proposal. So, is it chocolate ice cream with whipped cream and chocolate sprinkles on top? Nope. It's just the suggestion that the United States could implement what has already been successfully beta tested in other countries throughout the world. In fact, not only do we have to go no further for the United States than Canada to see a successful Medicare for All system that leads to better life expectancy, lower infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A program so successful that even Canadian conservatives have to pretend to want to support continuing it, which, by the way, you're not going to get with a multi-payer system, especially if middle-class people aren't on it, right? Because people will think, oh, I'm paying this like welfare for the poor. That's always going to be less of a political winner than something where you could say, we're all in this together. We are all benefiting from it in a way that would not be obvious if maybe people fell back on it in hard times, but normally they were covered by duplicate private insurance. And in fact, lots of countries have gone much further than Canada, and much further even than what Bernie Sanders is proposing quite successfully. If you look at countries like Great Britain or some of the Nordics, they've gone beyond Medicare for All to actually nationalizing most of their hospitals. And again, these programs are incredibly popular with the people who know them best. You don't see a lot of British conservatives, for example, saying we should abolish the NHS, because if they said that, they'd know that we'd never win another election. Is it unrealistic to think that we're going to abolish the private insurance industry? I'd say, well, right now, without some sort of major change in the terrain of political struggle, it's unrealistic to think that you're going to get Tulsi's multi-payer, single-payer plan, and it's it's probably even unrealistic to think that you're going to get the Pete Buttigieg Medicare for all who want it. What would need to change in order to make any of these ideas realistic? I know I've got just a little over 30 seconds. What would have to change is that you would have to get that kind of mobilized grassroots movement led by somebody who has what Bernie Sanders does not have, but would if he won the election, which he would have if he were the nominee, which is the presidential bully pulpit, and you're going to have a much easier time getting people excited about fighting for that if it's a clear and unambiguous thing that it should be illegal to do what the private health insurance companies do, which should just be a public good. That's going to be much easier to mobilize that army of people to fight for than something more confusing and ambiguous.
The next policy question is on foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, Tulsi obviously wins that hands down. Her stance, her one thing actually was all along ending regime change wars. She's spoken out against our interventionist mentality in Syria and Iran and North Korea and Yemen. So she actually made that the biggest thing she talked about during her campaign, which she should, because that is the one area where the president has the most power that they would have is in our foreign policy. So she was right to do that. So I actually do believe Tulsi with all her heart really believes in that. That's what she always led with. And she made that the focal point of her campaign. Now, Bernie Sanders, as far as foreign policy, is reinvented himself as this peace-loving grandpa. But it's just another one of the lies that he has spun to his supporters. You got to remember, as a member of the House for 14 years, he was called Bomber Bernie. And that's because he voted for the Bosnian troop deployment and the Serbian occupation. He voted for the Iran and Libya Sanctions Act of 96. Sanctions Act of 96. He helped author the Iraqi Liberation Act of 98, which of course led to the Iraq War, which he always famously says he voted against. So he basically built the baseball stadium, hired all the players, put the fans in the stands, cooked all the hot dogs, and said he voted against the game being played. He voted for the 99 Military Construction Act to build bases in Jordan, Kosovo, and Egypt. Why do you build bases in the Middle East? Geez, I don't know, maybe to park warcraft in. The intervention, like I said, in Serbia, the war in Afghanistan, the regime change in Libya. He led the regime change against Gaddafi in Libya. That was his resolution. In 2009, he voted to keep the Guantanamo torture facility open. And hell, even on the debate stage, he said he'd bomb the hell out of North Korea and China if they were aggressive. So this fictional creation, this avatar of a peace-loving old man, is a bald-faced lie. It's just one of the many fictions that Bernie has gotten his cult to believe in, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. Tulsi Gabbard, on the other hand, is very outspoken to the opposite. And you know, to that point, I've always asked myself, and Israel and I have discussed this, if Bernie was really on the side of peace and Green New Deal and health care for all and all that, and as you said, he's not a Democrat. He ran as an independent. Of course, he did that after going to the Kennedy Institute after he lost in Vermont in 1988 and realized he had a much better chance of winning as an independent in 1990 when he ran for the House, and it would block all other third-party candidates, which is kind of what he did here in 2020. He blocked the Jesse Venturas of the world for money because he sucks up so much of that independent voice, I guess. But I guess the biggest question is, if Bernie Sanders really legitimately believes in what you think he does, why didn't he endorse Jill Stein in 2016? Why did he endorse Hillary Clinton? He didn't have to. He wasn't a Democrat. He didn't sign anything that he had to endorse her. There's only, 3 or 4 candidates in the race. Once it was clear that the DNC had rigged the primary against him, why didn't he drop out and endorse Jill Stein? Maybe she'd have gotten more than 1%. But he didn't. He did it because he's part of the Democratic establishment. He's a sheepdog to make sure the progressives like Ben follow him just to the edge of the cliff where he said, look over there, there's the election, there's my presidency, and then he pushes you off. And that's what Bernie Sanders did in 2016. That's what he clearly did in 2020.
All right, Dr. Burgess.
All right. So one thing that I always find fascinating in these discussions with Tulsi supporters is that when we're talking about a comparative question, right, is Tulsi Gabbard or Bernie Sanders better on some issue? Oftentimes they have a very hard time sticking to that comparative question, and they wander over to the absolute question. Are there things about Bernie Sanders' foreign policy record to be critical of? Yeah, there are. But that has nothing to do with the comparative question. So, for example, in 1999, I'm old enough that I was 19 then. I participated in protests against the intervention in Kosovo. I've always considered that to be one of the most serious mistakes that Bernie Sanders made. His support of that. One ex-staffer who resigned after that called him Bomber Bernie, and that's been quoted in some far-left news sources since then. But the claim that he was known for 14 years as Bomber Bernie is ludicrously false and an insult to everybody's intelligence. In fact, on the most important votes, he has been consistently on the right side in the vast majority of cases. So he was opposed to the first Gulf War. He helped. He not only voted against the invasion of Iraq, but 2003, but he helped lead the opposition to it in the House. He's voted against various bills to fund it, etc. Now, would Tulsi Gabbard have voted differently in 1999 about Kosovo? Maybe, but it's unknowable. And in fact, when at least when I've looked this up before, I haven't even found anywhere where she retroactively says she would have voted against it, which would be the easiest thing in the world for her if she wanted to score some points about this. So if we're going to do the comparative analysis, which one is better, then we need to look at the places where they differ. So, is Kosovo one of the places where they differ? Doesn't seem to be the case. What we need is, all right, if you're going to say Tulsi Gabbard is better than Bernie Sanders on this stuff, what you need is a clear case of a U.S. intervention somewhere in the world that Bernie Sanders supported and Tulsi Gabbard opposed. I've made this challenge to Tulsi supporters many times before. I've never heard one be able to come up with one. Maybe you'll be the first. But as far as Tulsi Gabbard's problems with foreign policy that are relevant to the comparative question, well, here are a few relevant comparisons. Bernie Sanders never went on Fox News to say that President Obama's failure to say the magic words radical Islamic extremism or radical Islamic terrorism was somehow a detriment to American counterterrorism. Tulsi Gabbard did. Bernie Sanders never waffled on torture. Tulsi Gabbard also has a history of that, although she eventually came around to the right position. Bernie Sanders never said, I'm a hawk in the war on terrorists. Tulsi Gabbard did. Bernie Sanders was a clear and consistent supporter of the Iran deal, which as far as making a war so devastating, it would put the Iraq War in perspective, less likely, is probably the single most important foreign policy issue of the last several years. Tulsi Gabbard went back and forth. There was one she wasn't around to vote for or against it originally, but she's been very critical of it from the right. If you read Branko Marcetic's Jacobin article from 2019, yes, Tulsi Gabbard opposed the Iran deal. He goes through the history of some of her flip-flops on that. So on all of those questions, I know I've got about 30 seconds left. Bernie Sanders has actually been much better on foreign policy than Tulsi Gabbard.
All right. So the next question, the final question on policies is on systemic domestic policies. So, Dennis.
Yeah, and before I say that, pushback on Ben. Actually said she went on Fox to say about the fact that Obama wasn't calling them radical Islamic terrorists. Actually, she went on CNN and said that. And you're missing the point of why she did that. By not identifying them as radical Islamic terrorists, they were lumping together all Muslims. And what her point was is that all Muslims are not a threat to this country. It's the radical Islamic terrorists that are. So that's why she was saying that, not because she just wanted Obama to brand them as all radicals. So you completely missed the subtext of why that conversation, but that's all right. A lot of Bernie crats do that when they're talking about Tulsi. But also, in foreign policy, Bernie Sanders propagated, fueled probably as much as anyone outside of the lefty news media, the whole Russiagate narrative, which increased tensions between Russia and the United States. Bernie Sanders was one of the foremost propagators of Russiagate, as was the Bernie media like Young Turks, who kept fueling this fire about this evidence-free conspiracy theory, and Bernie was a part of it until it finally backfired on him. Finally, it came back on him, and then by then it was too late. It was post-Nevada. But how is that a better foreign policy to keep pushing this evidence-free conspiracy? How is it a better foreign policy for Tulsi Gabbard to applaud Trump for going to North Korea to de-escalate tensions, somewhat that he accelerated, but which have been there for decades, and Bernie Sanders saying, nope, if I think they're fueling nukes, I'll bomb them right off the planet? How on earth can you say Bernie Sanders, after everything I just explained about his involvement with developing our presence in the Middle East, how can you say that Bernie Sanders has anything but a shitty foreign policy stance across the board? I mean, I don't understand that. He pushes Russiagate.
Do you want to continue on with the remaining?
Yeah, I'll talk about domestic policy. So, like I said, with domestic policy, Tulsi was very clear about single-payer health, to make sure that single-payer was provided without the fantasy of eliminating private insurance, which will never happen in our lifetimes. Also, raising the minimum wage. Now, Bernie Sanders uses the $15 an hour minimum wage, which also, at least down in our economy locally, would lead to the greatest inflation we've ever seen. So Tulsi normally avoids putting a price tag on it. Vermont, one of the per capita, one of the priciest states in the country to live in, $15 an hour might cut it. But down here, it would put basically every mom and pop shop, every newspaper and fast food restaurant out of business if we paid everybody $15 an hour down here in Tennessee. So she hasn't really gotten into that so much. Tulsi's, like I said, her focus of her campaign was primarily on the purview of the president, which it should be. So she stuck mainly with foreign policy. But whenever she did talk about domestic policy, it was 90% in line with what Sanders has always talked about.
All right, Dr. Burgess.
Well, I can see why somebody who has the pro-Tulsi, anti-Bernie position here would spend most of their domestic policy time talking about foreign policy. But
that's what the president.
I don't want to repeat that here, but I do have to point out that if you look at the New York Times written interview Q&A with Bernie Sanders, which is one of the first things that comes up when you Google Bernie Sanders North Korea, there's a question about Donald Trump's. So, number 3, would you continue the personal diplomacy President Trump began with Kim Jong-un? Sanders' answer, yes. That seems pretty clear to me. And whereas I don't think that which network Tulsi used to repeat the right-wing talking point, nobody thought that Barack Obama was lumping together all Muslims. I think if you told most people that at any time in the Obama administration, left or right, they would have started laughing. I don't think that the question of which network she used to repeat that discredited right-wing talking point on is very relevant, just like I don't think which city the protest against the pipeline that Bernie Sanders joined was in is very relevant. On domestic policy, they claim that a minimum wage that minimum wage increases generally lead to increased unemployment or inflation. This is actually one of the most studied questions in empirical economics. There are decades of studies on this. It started intensively in the 1990s. I would recommend a paper from the Center for Economic Policy Research entitled "Why Do Minimum Wage Increases Have No Discernible Effect on Employment?" And in there, you see, whereas you do see some studies with small sample sizes, generally speaking, that do show some unemployment effects. If you look at the meta studies, where you look at all the data collected in a bunch of studies and synthesize it together, which is the more credible statistical technique, those effects really start to collapse. And you see, and you generally see in the meta, most of the meta studies, with very few exceptions, little effect to no effect from doing so. And if it were true, right, that there are small businesses that that I'm sure in some cases, I'm sure this is true, that do have a business model that's up that relies on paying their employees poverty wages, that they cannot stay in business if their employees don't remain in poverty. Well, if those small businesses in that category go out of business, then the question is, well, do the people who work there just not have jobs? If so, that would fall into the category of those employment effects that are looked at in those studies, or is it the case that you have maybe larger businesses, other businesses that eat up that part of the market share, and the overall employment is about the same overall? If so, I would say that lifting the working poor out of poverty, I like having a variety. Or man, I miss all this from before the plague. But being able to go to just to mom and pop restaurants, small coffee shops, corner bars, that all sounds wonderful right now. And I don't, as a consumer, I don't like corporate homogenization any more than anybody else does. But I think that if and when they are in conflict, I would say the goal of lifting the working poor out of poverty and the goal of having less business consolidation and homogenization, I would say two things. One, that the goal of lifting the working poor out of poverty just wins that for me every time.
30 seconds.
Two, it's just not it's not the case that you can't have small businesses at all that way. Here's an easy way to have a small business without having employees who are paid poverty wages. Organize it as a worker cooperative, which, by the way, is another one of my favorite things about Bernie Sanders on domestic policy. He didn't talk about it nearly as much as I'd like, but if you look at his economic policies on his website, he spent a lot of time pushing the virtues of worker co-ops.
So with this, where's that coming from? Okay. So with this final question before we move on to closing statements, just gonna give you guys 3 minutes to explain whose legacy is best for uniting the country. So.
Okay. All right. So the question is, who's best for uniting the country? And I think that Democrats believe that their leaders are picked by the voters and Republicans are installed by Martians. And it used to be the Republicans saw all Democrats as Jane Fonda and Democrats saw all Republicans as John Wayne, but today it's gotten worse. Now we think all Republicans are Alex Jones and they think all Democrats are RuPaul. So there's no middle ground between government other than, or between political parties, other than the corporations are great. War is wonderful, makes a ton of money. So for voters, the only common ground is that the media is horrible and Congress is worthless. And so we're trying to change that. We're trying to offer an alternative form of media for people to watch and get their information. And obviously we're trying to get rid of a lot of these corporate Democrats and Republicans and replace them. So how do we fix it? Now, the big question for me is, and why I've been so nice to Ben, is because I have to turn Ben into a Tulsi supporter, and I only have 4 years to do it. But I also have to turn my strict Baptist family up in Michigan to Tulsi supporters, although my dad did like it. So in football, you've got a head coach. And if that head coach blames the defense for every loss and for every problem, and game after game says, well, it's that doggone defense. That's why we're losers, guys. It's a doggone defense. He's not going to be coached for long. And in order to coach, you have to coach the whole team. And in order to govern, you have to govern the whole country. And what I saw in Tulsi Gabbard was the closest thing to being a uniter that we had seen in many years. So I feel personally that Bernie Sanders villainizes Republicans and conservatives. That's just, when he gets all red-faced and shouting and pounding his hands, it was always against Republicans, it was always against billionaires, and that's not a uniter. But Tulsi does have that ability. She is respected and admired by the conservative media, by the opposition. She doesn't scare anybody off. She packages progressive ideas in a way that doesn't offend, while respecting the issues that are key to Republican voters, which, let's face it, are abortion, guns, immigration, and religion. Those E4, and she respects their stances on those. So the closest that we have leaders who inspired, whether it's Teddy or FDR or Eisenhower or Nixon, remember Nixon won re-election in all 50 states, is we have to get people who respect the other side's key issues and say, if I can help them get those key issues or keep those things in place, then maybe they'll work with me to get what's important for me. And that's what we need in the presidency.
All right. Dr. Burgis, 3 minutes.
Yeah. Who is better at uniting the country? I would say, at the risk of sounding way too much like a philosophy professor for this context, that we have to start by disambiguating the question, right? What's the sense in which uniting the country is a good thing? What's the sense in which we should think of our goals a little bit differently? The sense in which uniting the country is a good thing and is a realistic and worthy goal is that right now a lot of working class people whose interests would be served by a left-wing economic platform are divided not so much by their support or opposition to that economic platform, but by secondary culture war issues, often fought not over key questions that might impact culture that are actually important to fight about, like who gets full civil rights and equality, like, for example, the gay rights movement's quite justified demands for marriage equality, which have been the law of the land now for a little while, but oftentimes over sort of very ephemeral secondary issues about the news cycle and signifiers and how we talk. But the goal isn't to unite everybody. And by the way, Bernie Sanders does do a lot of shouting. Maybe some of this is a difference between our ethnic backgrounds, but to me, he just kind of sounds like my grandma and her sisters. And it's a style I'm very familiar with and comfortable with. But he does plenty of shouting about establishment Democrats. And he particularly, as you say, does a lot of shouting about billionaires, and that's a good thing, because for the kind of unity that we want, the kind of unity between working class people in more culturally conservative areas and working class people in more culturally progressive areas, working class people from different racial and religious backgrounds, et cetera, instead of having a vague and impossible sort of unity between absolutely everybody that's never going to happen. That was the great delusion of the Obama presidency, that it was. I know I've got about 30 seconds left. Instead of that, the realistic thing that there's the possibility Bernie Sanders represents, and whatever candidate comes after him, I hope carries on that legacy, is that we can get working class unity against the 1%, against the billionaires who are the ones who have their collective feet on everybody else's neck right now, so that we can finally get basic things that, like the healthcare system that Canada has already had for decades.
All right, now it's time for the closing statements. You each have 2 minutes to give your closing statements. But before you do that, I want you to thank both of you again for coming on and keeping this debate very civil. So you guys can go ahead and start and give your closing statements now. You have 2 minutes each.
Yeah, if Bernie Sanders had been the Bernie Sanders of 2016 again in 2020, maybe I'd have backed him. It was kind of like we do with a lot of famous bands. You know, I'll always love Guns N' Roses for Appetite for Destruction, but everything that followed just wasn't quite as good as that one. But I still love them because of that first album. And it's the same thing with Bernie Sanders. He just never was close to that. And over the last 5 years, I've seen him bend to the establishment. I've seen that he has not gotten the Democratic-controlled House to even put Medicare for All up for a vote. Even with control of the House, with the Democrats, even with the squad in there, they won't even put it up for a vote. And what that shows me is we have to get rid of the hierarchy of this party. And the only way that's going to happen is to go head-to-head with the establishment, like Trump did with the Republicans, which is how he was able to tear them down and win. Now, unfortunately, it didn't matter because he invited them all right back in. But with Democrats, we've got to get rid of Hillary and Pelosi and Biden. And I'm sorry, we're going to have to get rid of Bernie as well. Because Bernie obviously is coalesced with them. He voted with the CARES Act. He's part of the Democratic hierarchy. He basically lied about Tulsi in the campaign, said she was out of the race when she wasn't. And he's going to have to go. So now we need to look at the next generation of Democratic leaders. And I'll be honest with you, of the young people who show the most promise.
30 seconds.
The best platform, Tulsi Gabbard is number one.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for inviting me to the debate. Thank you for hosting. I've enjoyed it. And I think that when it comes to the legacy of Bernie Sanders, we can see how he successfully and profoundly transformed the political conversation through simple, popular, politically potent demands like Medicare for all and a $15 minimum wage. Of course, it's true that even with Congress controlled by profoundly ideologically hostile corporate Democrats, and even with 4 whole members of the squad out of 435 members of Congress, somehow mysteriously Medicare for all didn't happen. That doesn't strike me as a big problem with Bernie. Similarly, the fact that he didn't endorse Jill Stein in 2016 doesn't strike me as a problem with Bernie. Whether you're a Democrat, independent who caucuses with a Democrat, or you have the D next to your name is irrelevant to that question. Ron Paul was a Republican, but he endorsed third-party candidates after running. The question, I believe the reason Bernie didn't is for the same reason that Tulsi Gabbard said she voted for Hillary in 2016, and the same reason that Tulsi endorsed Biden, even while Bernie was in the race in 2020. But I don't want to end on that. I want to end with 2 things that I absolutely do agree with Dennis about that are important to focus on going forward. The first
30 seconds.
Is that it's absolutely true that Appetite for Destruction was the best Guns N' Roses album. There are a smattering of good songs in later albums. They have a good greatest hits album, but as an album, Appetite for Destruction is really the only one that hangs together. Second is that we absolutely do need to overthrow the Democratic establishment. Nobody did more to talk about the importance of that for the last 5 years than Bernard Sanders.
That was exactly 2 minutes. Thank you so much, the viewers, for watching this debate. Hopefully this serves as an example of how you can all also converse with others, and we can all come to an understanding of why we all believe in what we believe in. Thanks again, Dennis and Dr. Burgis, for coming on, and to everybody else, don't forget to stay informed.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks for watching that segment of Hear Me Out. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell down below so you can get the latest on sports, pop culture, and progressive politics. Stay informed.